Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Today, we have the schus to be joined by Dr. Elana Stein Hain, and we are going to be exploring a tale of two Teshuvos of the Rambam. Dr. Elana Stein Hain earned her doctorate in religion at Columbia University and is alumna of the Yeshiva University Graduate Program in Advanced Talmudic Studies, aka GPATS, as well as the Consortium in Jewish Studies and Legal Theory Graduate Fellowship at Cardozo School of Law. She has previously served in educational leadership positions at Lincoln Square Synagogue, the Jewish Center, Wagner School at NYU, and now at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, though I believe now physically in Eretz Yisrael. Dr. Stein Hain is the author of Circumventing the Law, Rabbinic Perspectives on Legal Loopholes and Integrity, which was published by the Penn Press just in 2024. Mazel tov. And it's about the use of loopholes as a lens for understanding rabbinic views on law and ethics. And I know that the Teshuvos of the Rambam we're going to look at momentarily are really going to be a case study in your broader area of expertise. So maybe before we jump into our Teshuvos we'll be analyzing today, maybe tell our listeners a little bit about your scholarship and this book that you just published, as well as any other interesting projects that you're involved in.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. It's funny. I think what I would say is for about 20 years, people said to me, so when's the book? When's the book? When's the book? And here it is. So people say, oh, it's like having a baby. I said, no, it's like marrying off your child. This has been for a very, very long time. I've been interested in the question of what legal circumventions tell us about Chazal's view of halacha and what they think they're doing. In other words, what makes legal loopholes religious? And really what I found in the book is what I'm calling integrity, right? Integrity either of the goals of what a loophole is meant to achieve, meaning those goals are within the interests of halakha itself, like keeping people from sin, like allowing people to have simchat yom tov, like protecting people's money, right? HaTorah chasa al mamono shel Yisrael. Torah protects people's money, right? Or integrity of process. You might have wonderful goals, but the process might be, nope, this is going to undermine halacha too much. So one example that comes up is the conversation about explicit deoraita halachot that you're trying to get around. There are discussions, po v'sham, here and there in the Yerushalmi and in the Bavli, about the possibility that even if you have wonderful goals that align with the halacha itself, the process, or what I would call the procedural aspect, also has to have integrity. So I did that in the realm of Chazal, and I was so excited when you said, let's do a tshuva about it, because moving into the realm of medieval discussions of this, it's interesting to see the way it gets applied. And in this very tshuva, or one of them, one of the two, which speak to each other, we are going to see the use of the very term that Chazal use for legal circumventions, and that is ha'arama, hey, ayin, resh, mem, hey, which has both the serpentine connotation of the nachash, who is aru mikol chayat hasadeh, who is more cunning than all, and a Solomonic sense in Sefer Mishlei, where orma ani chokhma shachanti orma, you get chokhma, wisdom is in common sense and prudence, and Chazal use it in both ways. So that's really where we're coming from. Other things that I'm doing, I mean, I love the fact that you're doing so much real content on your podcast. And this is where I want to pitch two quick things. One is that every other week I have a podcast called Texting, where we actually learn a Torah text that is related, relevant to questions of the day. And that I would love for people to tune in. And the other is that I give a weekly shir called Din and Daf on the Hadron platform. That's a conceptual perspective on something from the Daf that week. And it's both podcast and video. So I am 100% with you in we need more real content out there. So thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. Oh, one last thing. If you want to buy the book, go to Penn's website. Please use this code PENN-ESHAIN, the number 30. Do not pay full price for this. I will be upset at you. Do not go to Amazon, go to Penn, and please use that 30% off discount.
Speaking about being chasam amonim shel Yisrael, caring for
Correct.
our poor wallets.
Correct. Why should anybody pay $60 for this book? That's ridiculous.
Such as is academia. Though something interesting that you mentioned, and I'm going to paraphrase, is that generally when we think about haramos and we think about circumventions, and as you mentioned, there's different ways to render the term, which is what makes it elusive. We sometimes think about people who are trying to circumvent the Torah. They don't want to have to deal with the demands of the Torah, so let's find a way to get around it. And I like what you said, that many things that we call a harama are actually finding clever ways to maintain the integrity of the Torah.
That's
So I
exactly
think
it.
this brings us to the tale of two Teshuvos of the Rambam. I think I just figured out the title that the podcast will have. I
Beautiful.
usually have to sit for like an hour after the episode and go into AI and figure out different combinations and then eventually come with a title. You helped me out. It was very easy. Now, okay, so this is our case study today. We've done many Teshuvos of the Rambam on the podcast. So what exactly are we looking at over here?
Sure. Okay, so we're talking about 12th century Cairo. Put yourself in that mindset. And this is a he said, she said. Unbelievable. Sadly, a marriage gone afoul. Okay, we have two different teshuvot. And remember, these teshuvot, they're not written by the petitioners themselves. They actually have legal intermediaries. They could be legal representatives, they could be rabbis, they could be judges, just people who are halachically knowledgeable. Doesn't mean that they didn't know anything themselves, meaning the petitioners themselves, but it meant this was the way it was done. So each one of these tells a story. One tells a story from the perspective of the husband, one tells a story from the perspective of the wife. Okay, so I want to tell you each of these stories. And of course, I'm interested in this because it gives such a vivid picture of life back then. And by the way, also how things have changed. The he said, she said, it's like, I mean, that's life. People see it's a Rashomon. People have different perspectives. And also, they're bringing to bear the things that shed positive light on themselves and maybe negative light on others, and to figure out who's telling the truth and what part of the truth, and obviously the use of harrowing. So here are the two stories. The first story, and I say first because I really do think chronologically the Rambam received this earlier. I think he received the husband's petition earlier. And you can find this if you're looking at HebrewBooks.org. You can find this Rambam, Shut HaRambam, Chelik Aleph, Siman Memhe. Okay? And what happens is the story goes as follows. A man was married to a woman. He had to be away for 4 years on and off. Sounds like very legitimate reasons. And when he comes back, he finds that his brother-in-law had become a melamed tinokot. He had become a teacher in cheder, so to speak. And his own wife was working with him, right? And he basically says, I don't want you to do this. I don't want you to be teaching Torah, he says to his wife, because fathers who come to visit their kids who are learning with you, that it's not tznius. And he even says, it's both for my sake, bishvili, v'gam lo bishvilech. I don't want it for your sake either, right? And then he says, how did she respond? Or the person who writes this on his behalf, how did she respond? V'kasher shama zot mimenu ishto zot haniskeret. When his wife heard this, itzikalo, she troubled him by doing what? She stopped doing her household wifely duties. She stopped baking bread, and she stopped cooking, and she stopped sleeping with him, and she stopped, what's the word I'm thinking of? I think like in Hebrew now a little bit. She stopped sweeping the house, right? She stopped washing the clothes, right? And so instead, what is she doing? She's working day and night to teach these children. And you know what? If he wants anybody to cook for him, he has to hire somebody. So he says, I'm tired of it. I'm tired of it. So what does he say? What does he ask the Rambam? He says, look, what I'd like to do is I'd like to marry another wife. Why would I like to marry another wife and not just divorce this person? Because when we got married, this person has a portion in the land that my mother lives on. And I'm afraid that she's going to sell her portion. It's going to leave the family. And so I'd rather keep her in the family and just marry another person. But there's one problem. We have a monogamy clause in our ketubah. Could you imagine Jews living in Muslim lands? And by the way, people write about this. Academics write about this. Jews living in Muslim lands in the Middle Ages often had a monogamy clause. She has a clause, he writes the clause in Aramaic. He says, I'm not allowed to marry another person, and I'm not even allowed to hire somebody who my wife doesn't like,
Now,
right?
how would you understand that? That's an interesting point, right? You have to put it explicitly in the ksuba, because I guess Chaim Rabbeinu Gershom developed as something more popular amongst the Ashkenazi
Yeah,
population.
they are living in Muslim lands. There's plenty of polygamy. There's plenty of polygamy. And
Hmm.
so what does the Rambam say to him? The Rambam says, look, you can't marry a second wife unless you plan to give her what was called the Ma'uchar, which we would call the Ketubah settlement. Okay? You can't. It's in your Ketubah. Tough luck, right? If you want to divorce her, then go marry someone else. Give her marriage settlement, divorce her, right? But you may prevent her from teaching the children. And in fact, Beit Din can come in and rebuke her and prevent her from teaching. And this is where it gets a little, I'm glad things are different than they were, okay? The Rambam says, V'im hi tovat hagirushin, lefi sheba'ala mon'a min halimud, if she claims that she wants a divorce because her husband is keeping her from teaching, lo tinatein lazut. It will not be given to her.
Oh, wow.
Ella, rather, noalim b'fanea hadlatot. Lock the doors in front of her. V'chosmim et hadrachim lekach. And block any way of her doing this. Umafkidim inyaneh le'orech hazman. Watch her for a while, ad shetachzor ba, until she reneges, v'tifratzel linhog le'meisharin ba'ala, and acts like an appropriate wife of his in Israel. Whoa.
This is a little bit confusing because it's the man who's initially demanding the divorce, and now we're worried that she's the one who's going to want the divorce. And Rambam's saying is both of you want a divorce, but neither of you are getting one.
Yeah, well, so it's interesting. Let's put it this way. He doesn't want a divorce. He wants to keep her in the family because he wants to keep her land in the family.
Mm.
Okay? That's what he says. And so the Rambam says maybe she'll be the one who wants the divorce. Okay? Now, I think this is really interesting, both in its sense of what are Jewish women supposed to be doing? Thank God we've moved to it. I just got to be honest, right? And also in the sense of interesting that she's a teacher, right? That itself is kind of interesting to think about in 12th century Cairo. And interesting that he can say to her, I'm sorry, I don't want you to teach. And one has to kind of think back to, or it's not back, but when you look in Mishnah Torah, the Rambam does actually talk about in Hilchot Talmud Torah, he does talk about in the second parak, I think it's the fourth halacha, where he says a single man should not be teaching tinokot, and a married woman or a woman shouldn't necessarily be teaching tinokot. And I think, it's interesting to consider that maybe he's allowed to say, like, I don't think that this is modest. Like, I don't think this is the right thing. Right.
Right. I don't
Now,
think that's unique to this particular context. I think the Rambam you're referencing, which maybe is also based on the Gemara Kiddushin, about a young man who's not married yet, there's the opposite concern that the mothers who are coming to pick up their kids are going to socialize with him. So that seems to be something that's been on the books for quite a while.
correct. Meaning, well, it's an interesting thing to wonder, is he against her being a milamedet tinokot, like inherently,
Ah.
or is it only because the husband doesn't want her to? Right. And I think that's where it gets interesting, because it's not necessarily that she can't do this. It's that if he doesn't want her to do this,
Right.
she can't do this. Right. So like, that's where you're sort of like, what's going on here? Okay, but let's go to the flip side. Right. And I say the flip side because the person who writes a tshuva on her behalf gives a very, very, very different story.
Very scathing account of this guy.
Very different story. If he's giving an account that she's the villain who, when she hears that he wants her to stop teaching, she stops doing everything around the house, her story is he's the villain, and actually he's a deadbeat, right? The basic question is, I have a deadbeat husband and father. He keeps leaving us. He doesn't support us. I need a job teaching Tanakh, and he wants me to quit.
It
right?
really, we're not going to obviously read through the whole thing. It's a little bit lengthy, but it really
It's
tugs
very
on your
long.
heartstrings. I was reading through it, and any sympathy I had for the guy dissipated. Goes away for 4 years and doesn't send any money. He completely abandons them.
She marries him when she's 9 years old. And by the time we see this tshuva coming to fruition, she's 25. She's had 2 children. He's left her, and here's the description. I mean, you could cry. Umiyom shenoldu ele habanim haniskarim, and from the time that her children were born, lo para ba'adam abihem mas gulgolet, their father never paid the poll tax for them, which of course in Muslim lands, Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians as dhimmi, second-class citizens, had to pay a poll tax. V'lo demei limud lebeit Talmud Torah. He didn't pay for them to go to school. V'lo hi bisham klal. He never gave them money to clothe themselves. Lo beged, lo mitznefet, any sort of clothing. Afilu lo hinil ragleim. He didn't even give them money for shoes. V'lo kana adayin machatzelet lebayit leforsa tachtehem. Ela pamachat. He only bought them a mattress once. V'lo kana lo keset lo kar. There were no pillows. There was not. But look, he bought nothing, no furniture. Afilu shemen hapishtan asher hi madlika bo. Even the oil that she used, and by the way, it's cheap oil, it's flax oil. Even the cheap oil that she used, she couldn't light any, she had no light in her house unless she paid for this cheap oil, right? She got no joy out of him, no pleasure out of him. And what we mean is not just, it's gam v'gam, it's emotional and it's financial. Afilu lo bedibur, she didn't even get anything positive from him in language. Zulati klalot v'charamot bilvad. He's abusive. He screams at them. He curses them, right? So what's her side of the story? She says he comes home. He sees that I am teaching. He says, I don't want you to teach. I want you to stay at home. She says, how am I going to stay at home? You can't support us. You can't support us. And she describes how he buys things for his mother, if he ever buys things, and doesn't even tell her that he's bought anything. And meanwhile, he's going around saying, my wife, essentially, it's fascinating. He's going around saying, my wife is a moredet. My wife essentially has rebelled against me in all the ways. And we'll get back to all the ways in a minute, because she lives at the Talmud Torah. She rents space there. She doesn't even live with me. She doesn't do anything for me. So meanwhile, he's going and living at his mother's house and bad-mouthing her. And she says to him, what's the problem? Just stay, just live with me. What's the problem? Live with me at the Talmud Torah. And he says, no, I want another wife. And that's what I think. You should stop teaching. And I want another wife. And if you don't stop teaching, I want another wife. And she says, no way are you going to get another wife. And now we know from the other tshuva that it's in her ketubah. It's a clause in her ketubah, right? And she says, there's no way that I'm going to quit. If I quit, I'll never be able to get the job back. And when you stop supporting me, like he even makes a promise to her, I'll borrow money and I'll support you. And she says, you know what? I know exactly what's going to happen. I'm going to leave my job. You're going to go away again. Mm-hmm. And me and my children, are going to be left with nothing. So she asks the Rambam, do I have to give up my job as he's demanding? And do I have to give him permission to marry a second wife? I mean, two sides of the same.
And I would have to imagine that once the Rambam was made of the full story and these harrowing details about how he just absolutely neglected his family and then has the chutzpah to come back and demand how they should conduct themselves when he decides to come back once every 4 years or whatever it is. I would imagine that would change how he paskins, but maybe tell me if I'm wrong. What does he paskin in the end?
Big time it changes what he paskins. He says, first of all, we have to force a husband to provide for his wife. And if he won't, or he can't, and I love that he says if he won't, or he can't, we have to force him to divorce her and to pay the me'uchar, the ketubah settlement. And then he adds, if he can, okay? So that's the first thing. He's got to be providing for you. And Beit Din, just like he said in the other tshuva, Beit Din has to step in and make sure that he's providing for you. And then, this is what brought me to the tshuva. To begin with, he says, V'derech harama lezot haisha, but a prudent circumvention for this woman. And then he says, Im divareha divrei emet, if she's telling the truth. Why does he say that? Because he saw the other version. He says, if she's telling the truth, if her version is right, then let me give you, because it seems to me he knows Beit Din is not stepping in and forcing him to support her, because it's been this way for almost 2 decades already, right? Or maybe 2.5 decades, actually, the way it seems to look, right? By the time this actually comes to the Rambam, she's been with him for 25 years, right? So he says, if she's telling the truth, then I'm going to give her a way out. Shetimrod, she should become a moredet. It's a moredet, a woman who refuses to sleep with her husband. She refuses to do her conjugal duties, and week by week, her ketubah gets diminished until she has no ketubah left. So she says, let her become a moredet, and let her leave that marriage without a ketubah settlement. Give up the ketubah settlement. And parentheses, he wasn't going to give her ketubah settlement anyway. The guy doesn't have a penny, right? Vikofinoto azla gersha. They are going to force him to divorce her. Once she's a moredet, they're going to force him to divorce her without a ketubah. V'tishaer b'reshut atzma, and let her stay in her own reshut, meaning under her own authority. And tilamed mi shetirtzeh, she can teach whoever she wants to teach. V'taseh ma shetirtzeh, and she can do whatever she wants to do. Right? This is very different.
This sounds like the classic Rambam everyone cites in Hilchos Gerushin about coercing the divorce. Though
yes.
This is that, but here he doesn't just say, bring over the boys with the baseball bats, but he actually finds a halachic way to make it work.
Yes, and this is what's so interesting, his use of haramat to say to her, look, I see that the system is failing you. I see that you're waiting for him to support you and no one's forcing him to support you now for 2.5 decades, right? So you got to do something. You become a moredet, the system will then kick into place. They will force him to divorce you, and then you're going to be able to teach. Now, again, going back to Hilchot Talmud Torah, Perek Bet, Halacha Dalet, where the Rambam says a woman should not be teaching Tinokot. Seems like the Rambam doesn't have a problem with her teaching Tinokot. It's only if he had a problem teaching, right? So very, very interesting. But here's another piece that I think is so cool. So these are written in Judeo-Arabic, right? And so the Judeo-Arabic that he uses is, I don't know Judeo-Arabic, so I'm just reading based on what I see, okay? So anybody who's listening to this who's a Judeo-Arabic specialist, growth mindset, let me know, send me an email. Al-Khila, okay? It's the word, I would say Hila or Khila, which is the Muslim terminology for subterfuge. Our harama is their Hila, right? Just like we have lahavdil, just like we have a subterfuge for taking rebit, for example, they have a subterfuge for taking rebit, right? And they have a term for it. So he uses that term, not that it's a Muslim, it's just an Arabic term, right? And I find that interesting also because part of the question, like one of the questions that I have in terms of the way that harama is used after Chazal is, are there environments in which the idea of a circumvention is considered verboten, like circumventions? What are you doing? And are there other environments in which the idea of circumvention, like that's a perfectly religious thing to do? And certainly if you're in Muslim society, it's a perfectly religious thing to do, right? And I think it's just interesting to ask where, like to just take a look at where things are used and how things are used and what's kind of in the zeitgeist and what's in the air.
Well, that's something that I admired about your angle on Haramos is that you kind of took a very zoomed out view. And from what I understand, you kind of looked at how other religious and legal systems understand how Haramos operate. I think it's an interesting thing to do an in-depth analysis and a comprehensive analysis of Jewish sources, but I think it's really fascinating to understand how the Islamic world and scholars have to come and approach a heter iska, how they have to deal with their issues of interest and other legal issues. And I'm curious, I know you've done work on this, but al regel achas, on one foot, what would you find are the similarities and points of contrast between the Jewish system, Islam? I mean, obviously, I'm
Yeah.
sure even within Islamic system, there's a lot of
Yeah, of
machlokas
course, of
and
course.
shivim
Well, the
panim
truth is,
Quran.
listen, what I would say is the stuff that I did in depth, I worked on Chazal in depth. So the parallels that I'm looking at, I don't even know what I meant by description. This is like thinking in Hebrew and thinking in English. It's hilarious.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been here for 2 weeks for those who are listening, a little less than 2 weeks. So I'm not sure what language, and now I'm in Aramaic and Judeo-Arabic, so I'm really confused. But the parallels are actually the Roman world and the Greek world in those environments. And the reason why I think parallels are so interesting is because we have the same problem today. I'll tell you what the problem is. Many of us look at loopholes, quote unquote, and we say, that can't be religious. That can't be religious. How can you get around the law? And I have to be honest, one of the reasons we think that is because we are deeply influenced by a Western culture, which was deeply rooted in Greco-Roman thought. In Greco-Roman thought, the rhetoric was no circumventions, no loopholes. They actually had a phrase, more law, less justice, meaning the more you use the technicalities of the law, the less you have justice, right? They also had a term. They had a term before we had a term, harama. They had a term, fraus legi, legal fraud. Does that sound to you like it's Solomonic? No, it sounds bad. And what I find is the fact that Chazal chose the term harama, which has both the Nachash and Mishle, is their way of saying it's actually in how you use it. If you use it in a way that maintains the integrity of the system, that's something that's very laudable and we care about. Whereas the Romans said, if you have a problem, just change the system, right? They call it equity. You have a problem, if the law doesn't work, just change it, right? That's not Chazal's way. And I love seeing that distinction because we have that same problem today. Chazal looked at Haramot as totally religious, it's actually part of Avodat Hashem. The limitations on Harama are just as important as the allowances, and the allowances are just as important as the limitations, right?
It's interesting, if I may, because you think of the ancient world, you're putting the Greco-Roman legal system and philosophy on one side, though I think when we look at the Gospels and we look at how Jesus challenged the Pharisees and challenged the Jews at the time, he was making arguments against fealty to the legal system. So you kind of have an argument on the opposite side of the spectrum as well, to do away with the law.
Actually, what I would like to suggest is that this whole letter and spirit business, it predates Christianity. It comes from Greco-Roman thought. Letter versus spirit, we prefer spirit. And Chazal say, and Boaz Cohen said this, decades ago at this point. He said, Chazal said, what do you mean? Sometimes you can get to the spirit using the letter, right? But I want to say even something a little further, which is the letter itself matters. The letter itself is not some like non-essential husk of something that's more significant, right? And that's what I think is so fascinating. Like the Rambam saying, why doesn't the Rambam just say, send in the Beit Din and tell them to talk to me? A, because it's not going to work, right? And B, because he has a legal way to deal with this, where he says, go use this harama. It's here for you. It's here for you. They're already bad-mouthing you. Go be a moredet, get out of this marriage, and go do what you got to do. And what's interesting is, could you imagine? I just want you to think about the controversy here. The local milamedet tinokot is in the midst of a terrible marital melange, I think is the word that I'm looking for. Like just a really bad situation. And it seems like him saying to her, go be a moredet. And she would not be afraid. If she would not be afraid to do that, it tells you she has some street cred. And everybody knows that her husband is a bum, right? Because otherwise, how could she be? You want to be the moredet who gets kicked out, and you're a melamedet, how are you going to? So there's a lot here that I think is just, I would say, I hope we can post with the show notes. There's in English, There is a translation of both of these for people who want them in an article that was written by an academic, and she called it "He Said, She Said," and I don't remember the subtitle, but people should look at it and think about it.
100%. And I think this is like a very helpful frame of thinking about these issues. One last thing I would be remiss if I didn't bring up, and to our listeners, I did ask for permission to bring this up and not just to throw it out of left field. Perhaps I think it's the iconic assertion from Blue Greenberg is that when there's a rabbinic will, there is a halachic way. And many people, I mean, I don't know. I wasn't in the room when she originally said it. But when I hear people repeat the line, it's generally done with a big dose of cynicism about the legitimacy and integrity of the halachic system, saying, it's whatever the rabbis feel like doing anyway, and the rabbis are just a bunch of human beings, and they are being pulled in a million different directions by whatever the context demands of them.
Yeah.
What would your response
So
be to that general idea?
I think my take is that the word integrity has to be somewhere. Meaning, when a circumvention has integrity, both in terms of the goal and in terms of the procedure, then Chazal, that's the kernel of what makes a harama religious. Now, how do you determine, and who gets to determine what a worthy goal is halachically, and what the parameters should be in terms of when a procedure is undermining the integrity of halacha, and it's not, that's not easy. But I think at the very least, if we can start with the sense of when a circumvention has integrity, then we can argue about what constitutes integrity. And I do think in some ways, what you end up seeing is that different communities and sub-communities will interpret integrity differently, like what are worthy goals, but also even will ask the question of, am I putting more of an emphasis on meeting the goal to be worthy and have integrity to halacha, or am I putting more of the emphasis on the procedural limitations of, even if the goal is good, if you're trying to get around this or that, it's actually going to weaken the system as a whole. Even that, you find different poskim going in different directions, where they're some pushing more towards the integrity of the goal, some pushing more to the integrity of the procedure. So I think it's a great question. And I think like any pointed comment, that comment or that characterization has garnered a lot of responses because it's so pointed. And what I would say is what's better than a pointed response is thinking about, okay, well, if that's not where I am, then what do I think constitutes like a religious ethos for this? And for me, I just keep going back to integrity, integrity, integrity.
That's an excellent message. And I think it's important whenever even if someone disagrees with a particular statement or ideology that's being promulgated, you shouldn't define yourself just by being opposed. You should
Right. You
proactively
don't
think
get
about
anywhere. You
what do
have to
you
get
stand for?
somewhere.
Right.
For
What are
sure.
your values actually?
Yeah.
And
And what are your parameters even?
Absolutely. We shouldn't just be reactive. We should be proactive. There's my nice little sermon line right over there. You see, I've been in the pulpit
Gorgeous.
for too long.
Gorgeous.
Anyway, Dr. Elana Stein Hain, I want to thank you, and I want to make our listeners aware that this is taking place just after a few days after you've made to Eretz Yisrael, juggling millions of things moving in, and nonetheless, you found time for Talmud Torah. So extra hakar tov to you, and much hatzlacha with being in Eretz Yisrael at a very important time, and I'm sure you'll bring much nechama that is very much needed.
Thank you so much. I mean, thanks for having me.